She asked for one night beside the fire, but when Evelyn woke before dawn and heard a saw cutting through pine, why was Holden Vail building a door for a woman he barely knew? The saw rasped through the darkness. Evelyn jerked awake beside the dying hearth, boots still on, one hand gripping her canvas sack. Across the room, Holden measured a pine board by lantern light. Then she saw the iron latch, and which side he was putting the lock on. Why hers? Tell me what you think below. Loose snow chased itself down the main street of Dust Hollow, Wyoming territory, slipping beneath boardwalks and piling against hitching posts already white with ice. Evelyn Mercer stood across from the Dust Halo Saloon and watched yellow lamplight tremble behind its windows. The wind found every tear in her coat. Her boots had split along both outer seams sometime before noon. She had wrapped one foot with a strip torn from an old flour sack, but the cloth was wet now, and she could barely feel her toes. Going inside meant warmth. It also meant faces, questions, people remembering her. For nearly 3 years, Evelyn had survived by leaving before anybody had reason to remember much. Another gust pushed her sideways. That decided it. She crossed the frozen street, climbed the 2 wooden steps, and opened the saloon door. Heat struck first, then tobacco smoke, coffee, wet wool, and the low rumble of men talking over cards. The room quieted for half a breath. Evelyn knew that kind of silence. She kept walking. At the bar, she placed a nickel on the scarred wood. Coffee. The bartender looked at the coin, then at her. That's your last one, isn't it? Coffee, she repeated. He poured from a blackened pot. Her hands shook badly enough that the cup clicked against the saucer. The bartender's eyes dropped toward her wrist. A dark brown stain showed beneath the frayed cuff of her sleeve. You hurt? Evelyn pulled the cloth down at once. It isn't mine. Something in her voice stopped the next question. She carried the coffee to the farthest table from the stove. That was where Holden Vail noticed her. He arrived nearly 20 minutes later, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat. He was taller than most men in the room, and carried himself without hurry, a working cowboy accustomed to being outside in weather that made other men complain. He ordered coffee instead of whiskey, and spoke briefly with the bartender about flour, lamp oil, and a storm coming down from the northwest. His brothers drifted in around him. Caleb came through the door, talking before he had both boots inside. Cain followed with the same face and none of the noise. Levi carried a harmonica tucked into his coat pocket. Jonah took a place near the wall and watched more than he spoke. The 6th Vail brother came in from the livery a few minutes afterward, rubbing warmth back into his hands. They looked less like 6 men gathering for a drink than 6 men trying to finish town business before weather closed the road. Holden's eyes crossed the room again. Evelyn sat stiff-backed in the corner, both hands around her cup. She was freezing. Yet she had chosen the chair farthest from the fire. He understood enough not to ask why. When he approached, he stopped well short of her table. Ma'am, Evelyn looked up. Holden Vail, my brothers and I run cattle about 10 miles east. She said nothing. We've got work if you want it. Cooking, mending, keeping the house from defeating 6 grown men. A faint argument broke out at the bar. 5, Cain said. Caleb looked offended. I clean. You move dirt from one place to another. Holden ignored them. Fair wages, he continued. Food, a roof. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. What else? Work. What do you expect besides that? Nothing. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because men rarely said nothing when they meant nothing. I'll manage, Holden nodded once. All right, and he walked away. That unsettled her more than persuasion would have. A few minutes later, the bartender told another traveler the cheap rooms upstairs were already taken. Outside, the wind struck the glass hard enough to rattle it. Evelyn stared at her empty cup. Holden and his brothers were pulling on coats near the door when she stood. Mr. Vail, He turned. She crossed the room slowly. One night, he waited. I don't need a bed. Her voice lowered. Just let me sleep by the fire. Holden studied her face, then stepped aside so she had a clear path to the door if she changed her mind. Wherever you feel safest. The ride east took close to 2 hours. Evelyn sat in the wagon with her canvas sack against her knees and quietly counted every fork in the road. The Vail Ranch finally appeared through blowing snow. A 2-story log house, sagging barn, smokehouse, windmill, corrals, cattle pens, and open country stretching black beneath the evening sky. Inside, the house was plain but warm. Holden showed her a small storage room off the upstairs hall. Could clear this out. Evelyn looked first at the window, then the door. Does it lock? Holden reached past the frame slowly enough that she could see his hand the whole time. He turned the iron latch. From inside. She tested it herself, then shook her head. Fire's fine. He did not argue. Supper was burned bacon, overcooked beans, and coffee strong enough to lift paint. Caleb tried to defend the meal. Cain told Evelyn not to encourage him. Lavi brought her an extra blanket and nearly tripped over a chair doing it. Jonah quietly stacked 3 more pieces of split oak beside the hearth. Nobody asked about Denver. Nobody asked about the blood. When Evelyn finally lay down beside the fire, she kept her boots on and tucked the canvas sack beneath her head. The brothers went upstairs. Holden remained below. Near midnight, Evelyn woke and saw him sitting at the long table with his sleeves rolled up, drawing measurements on the back of an old feed receipt. She closed her eyes again. Later, another sound pulled her awake. Scrape, pause, scrape, a handsaw. Gray light had barely begun to touch the windows when she followed the sound into the lean-to. Holden stood over 2 pine boards laid across sawhorses. A half-built door leaned against the wall. What are you doing? He glanced up. You asked for the fire tonight. He fitted another board into place. Didn't say you ought to need it tomorrow. Evelyn stared at the lumber. You're building me a room. Building a door first. Why? Holden set the saw down. Because a person ought to have a place where closing a door means something. Then he picked up his coat and headed outside to morning chores. Evelyn remained alone beside the unfinished frame. An iron latch rested on the workbench. She picked it up. Only then did she notice which side Holden had measured it for. Hers. Evelyn stood in the lean-to with the iron latch resting cold in her palm. Outside, a gate hinge groaned in the wind. Somewhere near the barn, Caleb shouted something about a missing hammer, and Cain answered that the hammer was exactly where Caleb had left it. The ranch was waking. Evelyn set the latch down carefully. By breakfast, she had made up her mind about one thing. If I stay, she told Holden, I work for wages. He was standing near the stove with a tin cup in one hand. How much? She had expected resistance. The question caught her short. They settled on a fair weekly amount, meals included. 1 week only. Either of them could end it after that. Holden did not add conditions. That first morning, Evelyn found flour in a stone crock, eggs gathered before daylight, bacon hanging in the smokehouse, molasses in a dark jar, and dried apples wrapped in cloth. She made bread. Real bread. By the time Jonah stepped into the kitchen, the room smelled of coffee, bacon, and hot flour crust. He stopped in the doorway. Caleb arrived next. Good Lord, Cain looked over his shoulder. Don't frighten it away. Levi came down carrying his harmonica and sat before anyone told him to. Holden entered last. For a moment, none of the brothers seemed certain what to do with the long table. Evelyn set down the skillet. Sit before it gets cold. They sat. That became the beginning of a rhythm. The men rode out after sunrise. Evelyn scrubbed, cooked, mended, counted pantry stores, and wrote what needed replacing on the back of old feed receipts. She was not gentle about disorder. On the third morning, Caleb tracked mud across a floor she had just scrubbed. She looked at the footprints, then at him. He followed her eyes. Those mine? Unless the cattle learned to wear boots. The next morning, every pair of muddy boots was lined neatly outside the kitchen door. Holden never laughed at her rules. More than that, he respected the ones she did not speak. When he needed a blanket stored in her room, he knocked. When the new door stuck in damp weather, he stood outside and asked if she wanted him to plane the edge. When she said yes, he waited until she opened it. Evelyn noticed. She noticed other things too. His work shirts carried mismatched buttons. He gave Levi the better piece of meat without making a show of it. He studied ranch accounts after midnight, rubbing one thumb along the edge of the ledger when the figures were bad. She began replacing his loose buttons without thinking about whose shirt she held. At night, Levi practiced the same unfinished melody in the woodshed. Slow, lonely, always stopping before the final phrase. One evening, Evelyn caught herself humming the missing part while kneading dough. She stopped immediately. From the doorway, Holden said nothing, but she knew he had heard. The seventh day came, then passed. Nobody asked if she was leaving. On the eighth morning, Holden paid her wages exactly as agreed and placed the coins beside her coffee cup. No speech, no question. Evelyn stayed. On the ninth evening, she returned from the well with 2 buckets and saw her upstairs door standing open. Her body reacted before her mind did. She set one bucket down too hard. Water sloshed across the floor. Her hand went to the small knife inside her skirt pocket. Then she stepped into the room. The storage space was gone. A pine bed stood against the wall. Cain had repaired the crooked window frame. Blue cloth hung over the glass in 2 uneven panels, stitched so badly she knew at once Caleb had helped. A candle sat on the small table. The loose floorboard near the cot had been replaced, and across the bed lay a quilt. Evelyn touched its edge. The cloth was old but carefully kept. Red squares, faded cream, tiny hand stitches. Holden's voice came from the hall. "Belonged to our mother." Evelyn turned sharply. On the table beside the candle rested an iron key. Her eyes moved from the key to Holden. "What does this cost?" His brow tightened. "What?" "This." She pointed at the bed, the curtains, the quilt. "What does it cost?" Understanding came slowly into his face. "Nothing." Evelyn gave a short, bitter breath. "Nothing doesn't exist. It does here. I never asked to be your charity. You aren't. You built me a bed. You earn your wages." His voice stayed level. "The room isn't wages. It's a room." "Why?" Holden looked past her at the blue curtains. "Because we wanted you to have one." That was worse. Evelyn felt something rise hard in her throat. Holden crossed only far enough to reach the table. He picked up the key and held it out. She did not take it at first, so he waited. Finally, Evelyn opened her hand. Holden laid the key across her palm without closing her fingers around it. "Your room, your lock, your choice." Then he went downstairs. That night, Evelyn sat on the edge of the pine bed in the dark. She touched the quilt, the key, the door, and sometime after midnight, she covered her face with both hands and cried without making a sound. By morning, she was angry, mostly at herself. She pulled her canvas sack from beneath the bed and began packing. Not much. 2 shirts, stockings, a comb, the old dress she wore when the road was dry. She had nearly finished when hoofbeats sounded outside. Holden came in later with blood drying across one palm, where barbed wire had sliced through his glove. "Sit," Evelyn said. "It's nothing." "Sit." He sat. She poured whiskey over the cut. Holden drew in a sharp breath. "You could warn a man. Wouldn't hurt less." His mouth moved like he almost smiled. She wrapped the hand with clean cloth, tight enough to hold without cutting circulation. When she finished, his fingers remained in hers for one quiet second. Then Holden looked toward the stairs. "You leaving?" Evelyn's hand stilled. "My week ended." "I know." "Then why haven't you asked?" "Because whether you stay isn't mine to decide." She finally looked at him. Holden flexed his bandaged hand. "Same wages, same room. Stay as long as you want. Leave when you're ready." Evelyn swallowed. "I'll think about it." That evening she went upstairs. The canvas sack remained open on the bed. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took out one dress. Only one. She hung it on the peg beside the blue curtains. Miles west of the Vail Ranch, a rider stopped at a freight station outside Dust Hollow and asked the clerk whether anyone had seen a black woman traveling alone under the name Evelyn Mercer. The clerk thought for a moment. Then he remembered the woman from the dust halo and pointed east. Evelyn knew nothing about that rider. Not yet. 2 mornings later, Jonah hitched the supply wagon before sunrise and called through the kitchen door that Holden wanted flour, coffee, salt, and lamp oil before the weather turned. Evelyn almost refused to go. Almost. Instead, she pulled on her dark wool coat, tucked her gloves into one pocket, and climbed onto the wagon beside Jonah. Dust Hollow looked smaller than she remembered. Snow lay gray along the boardwalk edges. Wagon wheels had cut brown channels through the main street. Men stood outside the feed store talking weather, while women moved between the general store and butcher, with baskets hooked over their arms. The moment Evelyn entered Morrison's store, the room changed. Nobody stopped speaking entirely. That would have been easier. Voices simply lowered. Jonah took a flour sack from the wall. Evelyn reached for coffee. Near the counter stood Ruth Garrett, wife of the rancher south of town. She was a narrow-faced woman in a brown calico dress, gloved hands resting on a basket of sewing notions. "I suppose you're the woman staying with the Vails." Evelyn turned. "I work there." "Yes. People have heard." Ruth's tone never sharpened. That made it worse. 6 unmarried men under one roof. A woman without family there. People naturally wonder whether the arrangement is proper. Evelyn set the coffee tin down. "What part concerns you?" Ruth blinked. "Reputation concerns everyone in a decent settlement." Jonah came around the end of the shelf. "If you're worried about decency," he said quietly, "start with how you speak to strangers." Ruth's cheeks colored. "I meant no offense." "Then you've got poor aim." Evelyn picked up the coffee. "We're finished here." She kept her back straight all the way outside. Only beside the wagon did her fingers begin to shake. She gripped the sideboard until it stopped. Jonah loaded the flour without looking directly at her. After they had ridden nearly a mile, he spoke. "Ruth Garrett has an opinion about weather, marriages, livestock, sermons, and probably the Lord's handwriting." Evelyn stared ahead. "I don't care what she thinks." "I know." A pause. "Still hurt." Evelyn glanced at him. Jonah kept his eyes on the road. Then he said, "You're one of us now." The wagon wheels rolled on through crusted snow. Evelyn turned toward the open prairie so he would not see her face. That evening she found Levi on the porch steps with his harmonica. The sky had gone deep blue. Stars showed over the north pasture. He played the same unfinished tune. This time Evelyn sat beside him. When he stopped before the last phrase, she asked, "Why do you always leave it there?" Levi turned the harmonica over in his fingers. "Can't decide how it ends." "Why?" "Don't know whether it's supposed to be sad or hopeful." Evelyn looked across the dark range. "Maybe a thing can be both." Levi considered that. Then he played the melody again. The blizzard arrived 2 days later. By noon, snow had covered the lower windows. By sundown, the barn disappeared behind white driven sideways hard enough to sting exposed skin. The Vails worked in shifts. Jonah hauled firewood. Cain checked the south pens. Caleb helped move cattle toward shelter. Holden kept going outside long after Evelyn thought any sensible man would have stopped. When he reached for his coat again near midnight, she stepped between him and the door. "No." Holden looked at her. "There's still stock outside. Your brothers need you alive more than those cattle need you dead." The room went quiet. For a moment, Evelyn thought he would argue. Instead, Holden slowly removed his gloves. "All right." That simple surrender struck her harder than defiance would have. The next afternoon, Caleb stumbled through the kitchen door with snow crusted to his trousers and no feeling in his feet. Cain was behind him, white-faced. Evelyn got Caleb beside the stove, removed his boots, and worked warmth back slowly, while Cain crouched beside his twin, without one joke between them. Later, Holden came in from securing the barn. His right hand was torn open again through the old bandage, and one side of his coat was muddy where he had fallen. "Sit," Evelyn said. He obeyed without protest this time. She cleaned his palm near the hearth. Holden watched her knot the fresh cloth. "You take care of everybody except yourself." Evelyn tightened the bandage. "I'm harder to manage." A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It stayed with her longer than it should have. The storm lasted 3 days. During the first night, Evelyn shared fire watch with Jonah. Neither said much. They fed split oak into the hearth, listened to the wind hammer the chimney, and let silence be enough. When the sky finally cleared, the ranch emerged damaged but standing. Fence gone along the east pasture. 3 cattle missing. Part of the shed roof torn away. Nobody dead. That evening, the 7 of them gathered at the long table. Caleb looked around at the hot stew, dry socks hanging near the stove, bandages, stacked firewood. "We'd have been in real trouble without you." Evelyn lifted her spoon. "I was doing my job." Levi looked at her. "You're staying, right?" Nobody moved. The iron key lay beside Evelyn's bowl where she had set it after coming downstairs. She touched it once, then looked at Holden. He gave her nothing. No nod, no plea. Just room to choose. "Yeah," Evelyn said. Her voice sounded too small. She tried again. "I'm staying." Caleb grinned. Cain hid his smile in his coffee. Holden looked down at his hands. The warmth lasted less than a week. Garrett rode into the yard with 3 armed ranch hands just before supper. His face was hard from winter losses. Holden and his brothers went outside. Evelyn stayed behind the window until Garrett raised his voice and pointed toward the house. Then she saw Holden's rifle beside the door. The old Evelyn would have stayed hidden. Instead, she took it and stepped onto the porch. Holden turned sharply. "Evelyn, inside." "No. This isn't your fight." She tightened her grip on the rifle, keeping the barrel lowered. "I'm not standing behind a door while you get shot." Garrett looked toward her with contempt, but whatever answer he had died when the 6 Vail brothers shifted together. Caleb gave a humorless breath. "Listen to her. Threaten her family and she gets mean." Family. The word hung between them. Garrett finally pulled his horse around. "This isn't finished." Holden's voice stayed flat. "It is if you've got sense." The riders disappeared down the frozen road. Only then did Evelyn realize her hands were trembling. Holden came toward her slowly and took the rifle from them. "Why'd you come out?" She looked at Jonah, at Cain and Caleb, at Levi, at Holden. "Because you're my family." No one joked. Holden's eyes held hers for one long second, and something in his face shifted into a truth he was not ready to speak. 3 days later, Dust Hollow's main well went dry. That night, Holden spread an old survey map across the kitchen table. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder. Her finger stopped on a line running down from the northern foothills. Then another, and another. Old irrigation cuts, buried for years. Holden looked at her. You know what those are? Evelyn kept her finger on the map. She remembered another farm, another winter, another part of the life she still refused to name. I know what water does when somebody gives it away through. Holden looked down at the old survey map. The paper had gone soft at the folds. Brown ink marked pasture boundaries, creek beds, wells, and 3 dotted lines descending from the northern foothills. Those cuts haven't carried water in 20 years, he said. Maybe they don't have to carry it the way they used to. Kane leaned over the table. They're buried. Some of them. You know that from a map? Evelyn shook her head. From watching land. The room quieted. She traced one finger along the lowest channel. A widow outside Cheyenne gave me work one spring. Her hired hand was an old irrigation man named Peter Lowe. He taught me to look at grade before looking at water. Said water usually tells you where it wants to go if you stop trying to argue with it. Holden's eyes stayed on her. It was more of her past than she had offered before. Not much. Enough. By morning, Dust Hollow had begun rationing. Morrison stood outside the general store measuring water into household buckets from 2 barrels hauled in from a private spring. A handwritten notice was nailed beside the door. 1 bucket per household until further notice. Men argued anyway. Livestock troughs stood half empty. Women carried covered pails home against the wind. Garrett had already sold 3 weak cattle rather than watch them worsen. At the Vail Ranch, Holden cut water use immediately. Coffee stayed. Caleb declared this proof that Holden still had Christian values. Everything else was measured. That night, they returned to the survey map. Evelyn tapped the junction where the 3 old channels met. If snowmelt is still coming off those hills, it'll be building behind whatever blocked this. Jonah frowned. Could be stone. Could be roots. Could be nothing, Kane said. Could be enough, Evelyn answered. Holden leaned back. You're asking 6 men to dig frozen ground based on a line drawn before Lively was born. 7 people. His eyes lifted to hers. You're not going. Yes, I am. No. Then don't go either. Caleb hid a smile behind his cup. Holden stared at her. Evelyn held his gaze. Finally, he looked back at the map. We leave at first light. Before sunrise, they loaded picks, shovels, pry bars, rope, blankets, coffee, and bread into the wagon. The ride north took 2 hours. The country changed as they climbed. Open prairie gave way to low, rocky ground patched with juniper. Old snow lay in the shadows. The wind carried the damp smell of thawing earth beneath the cold. When they reached the junction, even Caleb stopped talking. A whole bank had folded into the old cut. Roots tangled through packed soil. Stone filled the center. Levi stared at it. We're supposed to move that. Kane took a shovel from the wagon. No, we're supposed to complain until it moves itself. They started digging. The first hour barely marked the earth. By noon, Evelyn's gloves had worn through at the palms. Holden caught sight of the blood on the leather. Stop! I've had worse. That's not an argument. She wrapped both hands in strips of cloth. Now it is. He looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he handed her a smaller shovel. They kept working. The wind sharpened. Sweat cooled under wool. Caleb cursed every root he found. Kane told him the roots were winning. Levi's shoulders sagged. We're not getting anywhere. Holden drove his shovel into the bank again. We're still here. It was Evelyn who noticed the dark patch. At first she thought it was shadow. Then she saw the glimmer. Holden, he came beside her. Water seeped through a crack no wider than a finger. Jonah crouched. Pressure behind it, Evelyn nodded. There. Everyone moved to the weak point. Picks struck earth. Crowbars went under stone. The seep became a thin runnel, then a stream. Caleb wedged his bar beneath a flat rock and leaned his whole weight against it. Come on. The rock shifted. Kane shouted. The bank gave way. Water burst through hard enough to knock Caleb off his feet. Kane caught his coat and dragged him back. "Move!" Holden yelled. The earth under Evelyn's boot cracked. Holden grabbed her around the waist and pulled her clear as part of the bank collapsed into the channel. For several seconds they lay in the mud and cold grass. Evelyn half across his chest, both breathing hard. Neither moved. Then the sound reached them. Water, running, not trickling, running. They pushed themselves upright. The old channel had opened into a brown, rushing stream cutting downhill toward the valley. Levi laughed first, then Caleb, soaked from the knees down. Evelyn stood staring. After all those years of watching roads disappear behind her, there was something almost impossible about seeing water choose a direction and stay with it. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Holden looked at her. Mud streaked his face. He started laughing too. By the next evening, Dust Hollow's well had risen. The day after that, people began asking why. Morrison and Garrett followed the old cut north and rode to the Vail Ranch with 2 other men. Holden did not lie. "We cleared the junction." Morrison removed his hat. "You 7 did that?" Holden glanced at Evelyn. "She found the channel." Evelyn shook her head. 7 people opened it. At the town meeting 2 nights later, half the room stood to applaud. Not everyone. A few stayed seated. Evelyn preferred that. It felt more honest. Ruth Garrett found her near the back wall afterward. Her apology came stiffly. "I judged you before I knew you." Evelyn waited. Ruth swallowed. "My husband says we'd have lost the rest of the herd without that water." "That doesn't change what you said." "No." Ruth lowered her eyes. "But I'm sorry I said it. It wasn't perfect." Evelyn accepted it anyway. When they returned home, a basket sat on the porch. Bread, preserves, a folded note. "Thank you for giving us hope." Inside, Levi played his unfinished song. For the first time, the last phrase rose instead of falling. Evelyn stood in the kitchen beside Holden. He reached toward her hand. Stopped. Evelyn saw the hesitation. Then she closed the space herself and laid her fingers over his bandaged knuckles. Holden looked down at their hands, then at her. Neither spoke. The next afternoon, 3 riders came from the west. One wore a territorial deputy's badge. Another carried a leather document case. The third man lifted his face as they entered the yard. Evelyn dropped the water bucket. Holden turned at the sound. The deputy dismounted. "Evelyn Mercer?" She could not answer. The man with the document case opened it. "Maybe she'll answer to the name she used in Denver." Holden looked at her. That night, before midnight, Evelyn's canvas sack was packed again. The room seemed smaller with the bag open on the bed. Blue curtains, the old quilt, the pine frame Holden had built with his own hands, the iron key hanging beside the door. For months, every one of those things had meant safety. Now they felt like reasons leaving would hurt. Evelyn folded her last shirt and pushed it into the sack. A floorboard sounded in the hallway. Holden appeared at the doorway. He did not step across it. He did not block her way. "Tell me why." Evelyn kept tying the bag. "Because they came for me." "That's not what I asked." Her hands stopped. Outside, wind moved softly through the bare cottonwoods. 3 years of running had taught her how to disappear. It had never taught her how to explain. So she sat on the edge of the bed and finally did. In Denver, she had worked kitchen and laundry at a boarding house used by cattle buyers and freight men. One night, she carried clean linen past a private room and heard an argument over forged bills of sale. She saw Silas Crow strike a smaller livestock dealer during the struggle. The man fell and did not rise. Crow's foreman, Wade Danner, saw Evelyn in the doorway. "He knew I'd seen too much." Holden's jaw tightened. "What happened?" "He tried to keep me quiet." She looked at her hands. "I fought him, broke a bottle, cut him enough to get away. Crow had money, contracts, and friends in places Evelyn did not. By morning, the story had changed. Missing money, assault, a dangerous woman who had fled. Evelyn learned quickly that telling the truth and having people believe it were different things. So I ran. Holden said nothing. The blood on my sleeve when you found me wasn't old, she continued. Danner found me again before Dust Hollow. He'd been following my trail. We struggled near the freight road. He was hurt. I got away. You thought he'd come here. I knew he might. And you stayed. Her voice broke slightly. I wanted to. That was the hardest truth of all. Holden looked toward the packed sack. And now you're leaving without asking whether we want you to? I won't bring this to your door. His expression changed. Not rage, something quieter, worse. You don't trust me. I do. Not enough to let me decide what I'm willing to stand beside. Evelyn looked away. You don't owe me anything. Holden's voice dropped. This stopped being a debt a long time ago. He glanced toward the key. I didn't build that room because I wanted you trapped here. A pause. I built it so staying could be your choice. The room went still. Evelyn looked at the bag, then at Holden. Slowly she untied it. One shirt came out, then another. By sunrise, the canvas sack was empty. The men from Denver returned that afternoon with the territorial deputy and an attorney named Samuel Pike. Pike explained the papers carefully. They were not a simple arrest warrant. Silas Crow was under investigation for fraudulent cattle deeds and the death Evelyn had witnessed. Danner had survived and accused Evelyn of theft and assault. Pike needed her sworn statement. This time Evelyn did not run. The Vail brothers helped reconstruct the months behind her. Kane found the ranch ledger recording the exact day she arrived. Caleb remembered a stranger at the dust halo, asking questions about a woman traveling from Cheyenne. Levi remembered the dried blood on her coat before she had ever worked at the ranch. Morrison agreed to witness her statement. Even Ruth Garrett admitted she had seen Danner asking after Evelyn shortly before the winter storm. Garrett, humbled by his own failures, gave what little information he had without making excuses. The hearing was held in Dust Hollow's meeting hall. Danner stood under guard near the front. When Evelyn entered, he smiled as though 3 years had passed for nothing. She lies when she's cornered. Evelyn felt the old instinct rise. Door, road, distance. Then Holden sat down behind her. Not beside the deputy. Not in front of her, behind her, where she could stand on her own and still know he was there. Samuel Pike opened Crow's seized account books, forged sale records, payments to men connected with the dead livestock dealer, dates matching Evelyn's statement. Danner's story began to fail under its own weight. He raised his voice once. The deputy silenced him. That was all. No gunfight, no rescue. Evelyn simply kept answering, under her own name. When it was finished, she stepped outside into cold sunlight and realized nobody was chasing her. For several days afterward, Holden gave her space. He worked cattle, she worked the kitchen. Neither forced what had changed between them into words. Spring came slowly. Snow withdrew from the south wall first. Evelyn planted onions and beans there. One afternoon, Holden helped her set fence posts around the garden. Their hands met around the same hammer. Neither pulled away. That evening, they sat on the porch while Levi's harmonica drifted through an open window. Holden looked across the range. When I found you, I thought you needed shelter. Evelyn waited. Turns out you never needed somebody to make you strong. He looked at her then. I'd just like to be the man you don't have to run from. Evelyn took his hand. The same hand she had bandaged more than once. Then don't make me run! Wasn't planning to. He leaned toward her slowly enough that she could stop him. She didn't. Their kiss was brief, quiet, chosen. From inside, Caleb shouted, "Supper's getting cold." Cain answered, "You have the timing of a mule." Jonah laughed. Levi started the harmonica again. Evelyn looked toward the house. Months ago, she would have measured the distance to the road. Now she simply stood. That night, she paused in her room. The iron key still hung beside the frame. Holden had never asked for it back. Nobody ever would. She touched it once. Downstairs came chairs scraping, Caleb talking too loudly, Cain correcting him, Levi's music, Jonah's low voice, and Holden telling someone to save Evelyn a plate. She stepped into the hallway. The door remained open. At the bottom of the stairs, Holden looked up. There was an empty chair beside him. He did not pull it out. He simply left the space waiting. Evelyn sat down. Levi began the song he had spent all winter trying to finish. It was not entirely sad. It was not entirely hopeful. It was both. Outside, Wyoming wind moved through new grass where snow had once buried the ranch. Inside, the woman who had once asked for nothing more than one night beside a fire sat beside the cowboy who had spent that night building her a room. And the key stayed where it was. Not because Evelyn had forgotten what danger felt like. Because at last she knew the difference between a door she could not escape and a door she was free to open. Holden had never asked her to belong to him. He had simply given her enough safety, patience, and truth to choose. So she did. And maybe that is what made Evelyn's story worth remembering. Because sometimes home isn't the place where you were born. Sometimes it's the place where somebody finally stops asking you to prove you deserve to stay. Imagine being in Evelyn's place. Imagine spending years keeping your belongings packed, sleeping lightly, watching every doorway, because leaving first always seemed safer than being hurt again. Then imagine meeting someone who never tried to break down your walls. A man who simply built you a door, put the lock on your side, and waited for you to decide when to open it. Holden couldn't erase Evelyn's past. He couldn't promise that life in Wyoming would suddenly become gentle. What he could offer was something quieter. Loyalty without ownership, protection without control, and love without a debt attached to it. Maybe healing happens that way. Not in one grand moment, but through ordinary mornings, shared work, a chair waiting at the table, and someone who keeps showing up until your heart finally believes it is safe to stay. If Evelyn's journey touched something in you, tell me in the comments, what does home mean to you? And if you'd like to hear more stories of frontier love, second chances, hidden truths, and wounded hearts finding their way home, you're warmly invited to subscribe. There are more stories waiting beyond the next horizon.